Hey everyone, welcome to Mountain Beast Mysteries. I came across a very interesting article that supposedly details a sighting of Sasquatch and the capturing of said Sasquatch creature, along with two juveniles from back in 1839. This article was published in an issue of the Boston Times way back in the day, before the word Bigfoot or Sasquatch was even known. So it was referred to as a wild man of sorts, or an animal-like creature with human characteristics. But I'm going to go over this account. I'm going to go over the article. I'll read the whole thing. But when I'm going through the article, just take note of like the physical traits that are described. There's certain things that are definitely that of Sasquatch, certain traits that are that of Sasquatch, things that we know nowadays, like the way they describe the hair is exactly how it's described nowadays. And even things like the legs, they describe the legs as being bent and not straight like ours. If you look at the Patterson footage, you can see that the Patty creature, its legs are always bent. It never has its legs perfectly straight when it's walking. So there's a few details and characteristics of this thing that is described that do match more modern Bigfoot reports. This is an article that details the actual capturing of a Sasquatch. So there are some very outrageous claims. This creature was captured, it was caught, the two juveniles were caught, and who knows what even happened to them. Who knows what happened to them? There's nothing really that we can do to verify this. So right now it's just a story, and into the future it'll remain a story. It'll remain an anecdote and something that could potentially be real. But it happened near St. Peter's in Missouri. So it's not completely where you'd expect to have an encounter like this, but then again, sightings do happen all over the United States, east or west. So, and it's interesting to read the report and just listen to the words they use, just because Sasquatch wasn't a popular thing. The internet wasn't around back then, so they didn't really have any references to go off of. They just, saw this thing and figured it might be something like an orangutan or something like that. An animalistic creature. They describe it as being very animal-like in behavior and not so much human-like. But we're going to get into it. Mountain Beast Mysteries is an affiliate of Audible.com. If you go to audibletrial.com/mountainbeast, you can get a 30-day free trial of Audible where you can choose any audiobook of your choice to keep. So if you sign up using the code audibletrial.com/mountainbeast, you can go on Audible, and out of their whole library of audiobooks, no matter what the price of the audiobook, some of them are like $40. You can get it for free and you can keep it. Just remember to cancel the trial if you don't want to stay subscribed to Audible. But you get to keep your audiobook. They have a lot of good ones on there. I always recommend the Jurassic Park novel. Another one I like to recommend is Legends of the Nahanni Valley. You can get this book on Audible for free using this code. And Hammerson also has another book, a second book out there. So if you do like this one, get this one for free, and then if you like the other one, you can buy the other one. But it's a great place to get that book if you are doing road trips or anything like that, or if you're going camping and you want something to listen to. Books like that are perfect. Mystery books. They have everything. They got audio dramas as well. There's a really good one called Space 1969 that is really good. Definitely worth listening to. It has some big name actors in it and all the music and special effects and whatnot. So go to audibletrial.com/mountainbeast and do whatever you can to avoid reading at all costs. Robert Lincoln, agent of the New York Western Lumber Company, has just returned from the St. Peter's River near the head of steamboat navigation on the upper Mississippi, bringing with him a living wild man of the woods, with two small cubs supposed to be about 3 months old. Mr. Lincoln went out to the Northwest as agent of the New York Lumber Company in July, with a view to establish extensive sawmills on the pinelands near the Falls of St. Anthony, and he has given us a detail of the operation of the company and the circumstances which led to the capture of the extraordinary creature mentioned above. The company sent out their expedition last July. The workmen and laborers with the principal part of the machinery went by way of New Orleans, and at that city they chartered a steamboat and proceeded up the Mississippi. The whole business was under the direction of Mr. Lincoln. They had on board all the necessary tools and saws, together with the apparatus for a grist mill, cows, a good stack of provisions, ammunition, etc., etc. They passed quietly up the river and finally reached the St. Peter's in safety. During the winter, Mr. Lincoln and several of his workmen made frequent excursions in pursuit of game, which was very abundant, and their camp was one continued scene of festivity. The Indians brought in large quantities of furs, which Mr. Lincoln purchased for a mere trifle, and lined his cabins with them throughout, which rendered his rude hut very warm and comfortable. On about the 14th of January, 2 of the carpenters who had been out in pursuit of a gang of wolves that had proved to be very troublesome came into the camp and reported that they had seen a huge monster in the forest on a branch of the Mississippi, having the form of a man but much taller and stouter, covered with long hair, and of a frightful aspect. They stated that when seen he was on a log looking directly at them, and the moment they raised their muskets, he darted off into the thicket and disappeared. They saw him again in about a half hour, and he was apparently watching them, and when they turned towards him, he again disappeared. Mr. Lincoln was at first disposed to think lightly of this matter, believing that the men might have been mistaken about the size and height of the object, or supposing it might have been a trick of the Indians to frighten them. He was informed, however, by some natives that such a being had often been seen on the St. Peter's and near the falls of the Mississippi, and they proposed to guide a party of workmen to a bluff where it was thought it might be seen. The men were all ready for an adventure, and arming themselves with rifles and hunting knives, they started out for the bluff under the direction of Mr. Lincoln and the Indian guide. On the way they were joined by several of the natives, and the whole party totaled 23 people. They arrived at the bluff in the late afternoon of the 21st of January and camped in a cave or grotto at the foot of the hill. The next morning 2 of the Indians were sent out to reconnoiter, and in about an hour they returned, saying that they had seen the wild man on the other side of the hill. The whole party immediately prepared for the pursuit. Mr. Lincoln gave positive orders to the men to not fire upon him unless it should be necessary in self-defense, as he wished, if possible, to take him alive. The Indians stated that, although a powerful creature, he was believed to be perfectly harmless, and he's always fled at the approach of men. While Mr. Lincoln was giving his men their instructions, the wild man had appeared in sight. He ordered them to remain perfectly quiet, and taking out his pocket glass, he surveyed him for a few minutes. He appeared to be about 8 or 9 feet high, very athletic, and more like a beast standing upright than a man. The Indians had provided themselves with ropes, prepared to catch wild horses, with which they hoped to ensnare and bind the creature without maiming him. The instant the company moved towards him, he sprang forward with a horrid and frightful yell, which made the forest ring. The Indians followed close upon him, and Mr. Lincoln and his men brought up the rear. The pursuit was continued for nearly an hour, with the group gaining upon the creature and then losing sight of him again. He finally darted into a thicket, and they were unable to find him. They then began to retrace their steps towards the place of encampment. When within about a mile of the cave, the wild man made his appearance. They immediately gave chase again and accidentally drove the creature from the forest into an open prairie. At length he suddenly stopped and turned upon his pursuers. Mr. Lincoln was then in advance. Fearing that he might attack them or return to the woods and escape, he fired upon him and lodged a charge of buckshot into the calf of his leg. He fell immediately, and the Indians sprang forward and threw their ropes over his head, arms, and legs, and with much effort succeeded in binding him fast. He struggled, however, most desperately, gnashed his teeth, and howled in a frightful manner. They then formed a sort of stretcher with branches and limbs of trees and placed him upon it, and they carried him to the encampment. A watch was then placed over him, and every effort that could be devised to keep him quiet was used. But he continued to howl all throughout the night. Towards the morning, 2 small cubs about 3 feet high and very similar to the large monster came into the camp and were taken without resistance. As soon as the monster saw them, he became furious. He howled and thrashed about, and he ripped through several of the cords that were binding him. but he was then bound again and was kept most carefully watched and guarded. The next day he was placed on the stretcher and carried down to the mills on St. Peter's. For 2 or 3 days, Mr. Lincoln says he refused to eat or drink or take any kind of food, but continued to howl at intervals for about an hour at a time. The cubs took food very readily and became quiet, active, and playful. Mr. Lincoln is a native of Boston, and some of the workmen engaged at his mill are from this city. He arrived here on Sunday afternoon with the wild man and 2 cubs, and they were all removed from the vessel that evening. By invitation of Mr. Lincoln, who's an old acquaintance, we went down to his rooms to examine the monster. He's a horrid-looking creature. He's about 8 feet 3 inches high when standing tall, and his frame is of giant proportions in every part. His legs are not straight, but like those of any other 4-footed animal, and his whole body is covered with hide very much like that of a cow. His arms are very large and long and ill-proportioned. It does not appear from his manner that he ever walked on all fours. The fingers and toes are mere branches armed with stout claws. His head is covered with thick, coarse black hair, like the mane of a horse. The appearance of his countenance, if such may call it, is very disgusting, nay, almost horrible. It's covered with a thinner and lighter coat of hair than the rest of the body. There's no appearance of eyebrows. The mouth is very large and wide and similar to that of a baboon. His eyes are quite dull and heavy, and there is no indication of cunning about them. Mr. Lincoln says he is beyond dispute carnivorous, as he universally rejects bread and vegetables and eats flesh with great avidity. He thinks he is of the orang species, but from what we have seen, we are inclined to consider him a wild animal somewhat resembling a man. He is, to say the least, one of the most extraordinary creatures ever brought before the public from any part of the earth.